In the 1st century AD, the area around the Bay of Naples served as a holiday resort, where the ancient Romans could either visit the town of Herculaneum on the coast or travel further inland to the town of Pompeii. The area, it seems, was used mainly by wealthy Romans. Pompeii itself had impressive civil buildings, sports arenas, theaters, and temples. In Herculaneum, villas lined the Bay of Naples decked out with fine furnishings. In their prime, these villas must have been an incredible sight. Today, the sad remains of these once thriving towns lie silent and mournful under the Italian sun. Pompeii and Herculaneum were destroyed by a huge natural disaster, a violent volcanic eruption which entombed both towns in ash and rock. But that same disaster has also preserved a unique picture of life in ancient Rome, nearly 2,000 years ago.
One of the great things about Pompeii, as well as being a superb archaeological story, it was also almost a terrific detective story as well, because there was so much we did know about Pompeii, but until this century there were also a great deal of unresolved mysteries.
Pompeii was founded on the end of a natural outcrop, actually an old lava flow from Vesuvius, which came down very close to the mouth of a river, which formed a natural bay on the Bay of Naples. And it would look as if the first moves to settle Pompeii permanently were taken in the 6th century BC.
When a natural catastrophe strikes, it is often unexpected and brings with it terrible consequences. The unexpected eruption of Mount Vesuvius was one of the most violent natural disasters of all time. At noon, on August 24th, AD 79, the peak of Vesuvius suddenly erupted. A horrifying crash shook the earth violently. As the crater split open, a column of ash, rock, and smoke was thrown over 15 miles up into the atmosphere. Daylight turned to darkness as the thick cloud mushroomed, blocking out the sun. At once, the people of Pompeii and Herculaneum were thrown into panic and confusion.
Treat yourself to the best gift in history this holiday season. Enjoy unlimited access to award-winning podcasts and thousands of hours of original history documentaries released weekly exclusively on History Hit. There are topics for all history lovers, from Pompeii to D-Day. Sign up via the link in the description for an exclusive discount. Don't miss out on this incredible opportunity to explore the past like never before with History Hit.
It seems that only a few people died in the initial eruption, but the next day thousands were entombed in Pompeii, taken by surprise by the powerful explosive flow of red-hot rock and ash.
The red-hot ash and debris from the volcano, when it comes tumbling down the side of the mountain, is almost gelled together, so it becomes a kind of liquid, like a river. It flowed down over the mountain and through the city, and it was this that did this destruction in Pompeii.
It had begun like any other summer's day. The sky was clear, and the sun shone brilliantly. The shimmering water of the Bay of Naples was calm and turquoise blue. The lush green slopes of Vesuvius provided the dramatic backdrop for the summer scene. People were going about their daily business, and the rich, safe town of Pompeii hummed with activity. Roman mythology suggested that volcanoes were gateways to the underworld, but the people who lived in the Bay of Naples region thought that Vesuvius was simply a large hill. Vesuvius had been silent for almost 1,000 years. How could the population possibly know that a savage disaster was about to consume this thriving, prosperous, and apparently secure Roman town? Therefore, no one knew or recognized the significance of the warning signs. Over the previous few days, there had been some minor earth tremors. All local sources of water had dried up. As morning broke on August 24th, AD 79, the weather was excellent. People moved on with the business of their daily lives. The market stalls were open. Tradesmen had removed the shutters from their shop fronts and were busy selling their merchandise. The bars served snacks and wine, and the bakers offered freshly baked bread. The doors of the public baths were open for business. Women filled jars with water from the public fountains. As the morning passed without event, families and friends gathered to eat lunch together. Then Vesuvius erupted. The huge explosion drew people out into the streets. As they stood aghast, looking at the volcano, the burning rock, ash, and pumice poured out of the crater. The sun vanished, and Pompeii was plunged into darkness. Chaos broke out as people panicked and fled. For the next 12 hours, there was a constant heavy downfall of scorching pumice and ash. It buried Pompeii and Herculaneum under 6 feet of debris. The traditional explanation is that all those who died at Pompeii were buried under the fallout from the volcano. It was only after close studies of the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens that the real truth about the fate of Pompeii became graphically clear. We owe our knowledge of the events that terrible day to 2 letters, which have survived for nearly 2,000 years. They were written to the historian Tacitus in AD 104 by Pliny the Younger. He was the nephew of Pliny the Elder, admiral of the Roman Mediterranean fleet, which was based at Misenum, to the north of Naples. Pliny's letters vividly describe the eruption and tell us how his uncle died on the beach at Stabii. Pliny the Elder was a keen scientist and wished to see the results of the eruption at close hand. So he ordered a ship to be rowed across the bay, hoping to save as many people as possible. He left his nephew behind at Misenum. The rough seas and falling rocks made it difficult to land, so Pliny ordered the ship to row to Stabii, at the south of the bay. While trying to reach the shore, Pliny the Elder was overcome by poisonous fumes and died.
At the time of the explosion, Pliny the Younger left us a very detailed record of the events. First of all, he describes the initial explosion, which we now know was probably the result of the pressure underneath the volcano. And what's very interesting is that he subsequently describes the collapse of the cloud of ash and smoke and how it sweeps over the landscape.
Young Pliny tells us after several violent tremors, he feared that his house would collapse. He persuaded his mother that they should leave as the tremors continued. Next, he witnessed what would become known to science as a pyroclastic flow, in which he described an ominous thick smoke spreading over the earth like a flood, which followed behind us. Pliny and his mother escaped into the fields, but were surrounded by darkness. All they could hear were the screams and wails of the men, women, and children. When the daylight returned 2 days later, it revealed a chilling scene. Almost all the southern end of the bay had been buried. The whole center of Mount Vesuvius was blown out by the eruption, and where the sides had collapsed, a vast new crater had been created. The enormous cone of Vesuvius was now just a stump. The slopes of the volcano, where lush woods, vineyards, olive groves, and villas once stood, was now a wasteland. Earthquakes and tidal waves had destroyed buildings, and all the remains were covered in a thick layer of ash.
Pompeii represents the ideal archaeological site. It is actually a complete assemblage of buildings and their contents, and all manner of references to particular individuals within a known context, and that's really the appeal of Pompeii, with the added advantage even that it was actually stopped at a particular moment in time.
At Pompeii, the tops of ruined buildings were the only visible reminder that it had ever existed. Soon, even these were taken to be used to build new shelters for the homeless. Mount Vesuvius remained active for another 1,300 years, until around 1400, coating Pompeii with layer after layer of volcanic debris. The puzzle for scientists was always to explain why so many of the citizens died, and why the mangled bodies were found on top of the ash which filled the streets, and not buried beneath. After all, the people could simply have fled indoors to avoid the falling rocks, and most would have survived. Lava from volcanoes flows slowly, and it is fairly easy to avoid, so it could not have been that which killed the inhabitants. Recently, scientists have discovered that what actually killed them was a sudden and violent torrent of burning hot rock and ash, which flowed over Pompeii.
That's why we find a lot of the bodies are actually on top of the preliminary ash and rock from the first eruption, because when that was thrown into the air and rained down on Pompeii, it was fairly easy to avoid that. All they had to do really was to go indoors to avoid the falling ash. But when people on the second day were hit in the streets, that's when the bulk of the people were killed. That's why we find so many bodies that have been dismembered and mangled in such a severe way.
About 5,000 people died at Pompeii, 1/4 of its estimated population. The survivors probably fled on the first day of the eruption. Those who remained behind were sealed in with the rest of the town, like a time capsule. Ash and rock surrounded their remains. Soil concealed the site, and plants and shrubs and trees grew among the ash. At the time of the eruption, the citizens of Pompeii enjoyed an era of thriving development and peace. By AD 79, the town had become a prosperous commercial center, with an industrious, creative, and growing population. The prosperity of the town is reflected in the splendid public buildings. The Forum was the religious, political, and economic center of the Roman resort. Market stalls stood along covered doorways where customers haggled over goods. At the south end of the Forum were the council offices and the law courts. The north end was dominated by the temples of Jupiter, Lauris, and Vespasian. The wool and cloth markets, the main market, the fuller's building of Eumatia, and the office of weights and measures formed the commercial center of the Forum. Nearby were other public buildings, including a sports ground, the Temple of Isis, and the Temple of Jupiter Malachiosis. In the area near a second sports ground was the vast amphitheater.
One of the most interesting aspects of Roman civilization is this fact of living in cities and the nature of Roman towns. And Pompeii has a theatre, an amphitheatre, basilica. It has all the features that make up the sort of model Roman town.
The public baths were built on main roads. These formed an essential part of daily life. Some roads had a more commercial nature, with shops and taverns. Also, a semi-rural area with vineyards and gardens survived in the center of the town. Almost all of the remaining areas of the town were residential. Rooms facing the street could be let out as shops or taverns. Sometimes whole houses were transformed into laundries, bakeries, or small factories. Rich and poor, families and businesses lived and worked in very close proximity. Estates on the fertile slopes of Vesuvius grew grapes, olives, cereal, vegetables, and animal food, or reared animals. Pompeii needed its own market garden to keep up supplies of food. Pompeii's other main industries were the production of wine and woolen cloth. Many Pompeians made their living either manufacturing items for export or importing other items from abroad. Some agricultural produce, such as wine and olive oil, was exported as far as North Africa, while pottery was imported from southern France. Thanks to Pompeii's thriving seaport, sea traders operated a complex network of contacts with the Orient, Africa, and Asia.
From the moment of its foundation to the moment of its destruction, its primary function as a city was as a port for the area. This is one reason, actually, why Pompeii was probably not rebuilt after the eruption. It could have been salvaged. It wasn't that deeply buried, but it's very possible that its harbour, that its port, its actual raison d'etre, was destroyed in the eruption.
The people of Pompeii seem to have found a great deal of time for leisure, rest, and relaxation. The town certainly had a variety of activities on offer. The great theater showed comedies and tragedies to spectators, who were protected from the sun by covers and sprinkled with scented water. The second main venue was the Odeon, which was used for concerts, poetry recitals, and lectures. The enormous amphitheater held the games and had a capacity of 20,000 people, who took their places according to a strict social hierarchy. The games included such spectacles as gladiator fights, animal duels, or hunts, and possibly chariot racing. The gladiators were incredibly popular. They lived and trained in the nearby barracks. 63 people died there in the eruption. In their duels, most gladiators were killed on their first appearance. Those who survived won respect, freedom, and wealth. In the centuries following the eruption, people slowly returned to live in the area, establishing new towns and villages. But Pompeii's time capsule was to remain undiscovered until the 18th century. One of the most famous sights of Pompeii are the plaster cast bodies. These are not actual bodies. They are made from the molds of impressions left by bodies buried in the ash. This process reveals an astonishing amount of detail: clothes, shoes, and facial expressions. These terrified and tortured faces of those who died in the eruption have been preserved for almost 2,000 years. The reason for the excavations at Pompeii was that archaeologists and historians could use the discoveries to piece together a picture of the town, the townspeople, and life in the Roman Empire. So, why did the tragedy strike Pompeii? Could the town's death have been avoided? Vesuvius lies on the fault line that also includes the nearby volcanoes Etna and Stromboli. Depending on the activity of these plates, a volcano can lie dormant for many years.
Volcanoes occur at weak points in the earth crust where the pressure of the molten rock beneath forces its way through the surface. In most instances, volcanic eruptions are relatively harmless because lava moves very slowly and people generally have time to avoid it. Where it gets dangerous is where there's a pressure beneath the Earth's surface which results in effectively a huge explosion, and that's what's happened at Pompeii.
Prior to AD 79, Vesuvius had been totally inactive for almost 1,000 years. But inside the Earth, the pressure grew, and molten rock, known as magma, collected in the volcano's chamber. Eruptions occur when the pressure under the plate is strong enough to force the magma through weak spots in the Earth's crust. When this magma reaches the surface, its path may be free, in which case it would flow slowly down the sides of a mountain. Or it may be blocked, in which case there can be a huge eruption. The eruption of Vesuvius in AD 79 showed the consequences of such a blockage. When dormant, magma deposits in the crater and shaft may cool and solidify, forming a plug. If the magma cannot escape, the pressure eventually smashes and explodes the plug out, blasting ash and rock fragments thousands of meters into the air. This is what happened at Pompeii. There were warnings that would have alerted modern scientists. Earth tremors and the natural sources of water running dry due to the rise in ground temperature are just two clues which warn of an eruption. But how were the residents of Pompeii in AD 79 to know the significance of these things? It was when Mount St. Helens in Washington erupted in 1980 that the answers to these mysteries were revealed. As the scientists watched from a safe distance, they witnessed a previously unknown phenomenon. As the sides of the volcano exploded, a wave of rock and ash spewed out of the crater. Like the flood that Pliny the Younger had written of after AD 79, it traveled at 100 miles an hour at a temperature of 200 degrees centigrade, scorching and smashing everything in its path. For those that had pondered the fate of Pompeii, all the pieces fell into place. Today at Pompeii, much of the site remains unexcavated. Archaeologists now use modern technology and equipment to sift the remains for the last clues to the past. Preservation and conservation experts work on mosaics and paintings, protecting them from the weather and restoring them to their best condition. Under the ash, Pompeii had been safe, but the wind, rain, eruptions, and earthquakes have continued the destruction of the town. Preserving the uncovered ruins is just as vital as continuing the excavations.
Pompeii, unfortunately, is a ruin, and just like any ruin, it's likely to become more ruinous the more time it spends exposed to even quite normal weathering. The problem with the modern environment that is also full of pollutants. The other thing is that tourists themselves are quite a challenge to the structure of the town. The numbers of people who walk through the remains each year, which run into their hundreds of thousands, can also bring a considerable amount of damage with them.
It is a major task to protect Pompeii so that future generations have the benefit of learning about the town and of life in the Roman Empire. It is also important that these future generations learn about the death of Pompeii. The busy Italian city of Naples lies in the shadow of Vesuvius, but the volcano has been silent for over 50 years. But, as Pompeii proves, this does not mean it is not active. Naples today is densely populated. The weather and work are good. People are happy and getting on with their daily business. It is a modern-day reflection of Pompeii, and just as vulnerable.
Even today, Rome is a city which fascinates us with its mixture of the sophisticated and the romantic, the sacred and the profane. This modern, bustling city is also the place where the treasures of the Renaissance stand side by side with the stark edifices of Mussolini's Italy. And in amongst it all are reminders of the great civilization which stood on the same 7 hills. The beginnings of that civilization are shrouded in legend, in the twin brothers Romulus and Remus, who were nursed by wolves, but who grew up to found the great city in 753 BC. Archaeologists now believe that Rome began around 3,000 years ago as a collection of wooden huts on 7 hills beside the river Tiber. But however humble its origins may have been, the city which developed would become, over the following 1,000 years, so sophisticated in its social structures and so effective in its political and legal ordering that it would take over the known world and prove the basis of the culture which the West still calls its own. In a very real sense, when we look at the treasures of ancient Rome, we are looking into our own beginnings.
You think of all the things we've got from Roman culture, its language, Latin, its law, tremendous amount of our artistic and architectural heritage is ultimately derived from the Roman world. And of course, ancient Rome as the heart of that ancient world is potentially the source for everything that we understand to be classical civilization.
Romulus, so the story goes, founded the city on the Palatine Hill in 753 BC. A small village in a not very prepossessing location with its marketplace on marshy ground between the Palatine and the Capitoline Hills grew to be the birthplace of modern civilization. It was not a quick nor an easy transition, and the martial history of Rome is marked at its outset by many defeats at the hands of the other Italian tribes of the time. But their persistence paid off, and by the 3rd century BC, the Romans had conquered most of Italy. This brought them into conflict with the Greeks. It was the conquering of this more advanced people that propelled the Romans into becoming great cultural as well as great martial imperialists. The arts and sciences of Greece flowed into Rome. Medicine, astronomy, literature, rhetoric, and of course, architecture.
The Romans had the largest empire that the Western world has really ever known in terms of the physical extent of it. And in the sense that they conquered the whole of the world in terms of peoples and places, they also conquered nature to some extent. If you think about Roman roads, Roman aqueducts, Roman harbours, they were changing the shape of the whole of the landscape, cutting roads through mountains, making tunnels, cuttings, taking water over land, so therefore making rivers, making solid structures in the sea. But you can also see it if you actually look at the city of Rome itself, because although Rome started off as a city on 7 famous hills, but also perhaps another 3 or 4, not all of these hills are now anything like the shape they were when the Romans began. Particularly something like the Palatine Hill has been levelled on the top, it's been extended on the sides. The building of Domitian's palace, for example, involved cutting away part of the hill to create the sunken stadium, but also building up and terracing out towards the Forum. And the sort of views and panoramas that we get today are largely a result of Roman reshaping of the whole of the Palatine Hill.
The view from the Palatine Hill is perhaps the best preserved of its features, a feature, of course, which owes its existence to no human architect. In the distance, the original occupants of the royal palaces would have been able to see the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, and in the valley below they would have seen the Roman Forum.
Well, the Forum actually is, in origin, simply an open space in the valley bottom between three of the major hills of Rome. It is the sort of rather marshy inlet from the Tiber which separates the Palatine Hill, the Capitoline Hill and the Quirinal Hill. And as such, it was a sort of communal meeting place. Parts of it on the fringes seem to have been used as cemetery, but the main sort of central part gradually grew up as a marketplace and as a political centre. The excavations which have been carried out there, it's the one area in Rome which has actually been consciously excavated for archaeological purposes. It was excavated towards the end of the last century, between about 1880 and 1910. There were concerted efforts to actually expose the Roman Forum. And what we have on the ground now, in fact, as ever with the rest of Rome, is its final phase rather than its beginnings.
The remains of this site have been excavated and have stood the test of time, whereas the Palatine has not. Although the Forum was founded with Rome in the 8th century BC, those ruins which can be seen on the site are, like those of the Palatine, mostly of a much later date. For instance, what remains of the Temple of Saturn, the god who was father to Jupiter, the chief Roman god, he whose temple sat on the Capitoline Hill, are 6 Ionic pillars which date from its rebuilding in about 370 AD. There is nothing left of the original, which was built in 497 BC. Likewise, the Temple of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, was first built in the 6th century BC as no more than a wooden hut. But the remains we can see here date from the 3rd century AD. It was here that the great symbol of Rome's endurance was tended, the eternal flame. Its maintenance was entrusted to the Vestal priestess, and the sacredness of their vocation was such that each was expected to swear an oath of chastity and to keep it on pain of being buried alive. The remains of their house can also be seen, although again the traces of this building, dating from after 64 AD, hide those of the much more ancient building which would have sheltered the first of the Vestal Virgins. Beyond this can be seen the most famous of the treasures of ancient Rome. And this is no solemn place of worship, dedicated to a god or deified man, nor is it an arch erected to celebrate some triumph by a great emperor. It is a monument to the Romans' ability to enjoy themselves, and enjoy themselves in ways which would turn the stomachs of most people today. Commissioned in 72 AD as the Flavian Amphitheatre and built in the grounds of Nero's Golden Palace, the Colosseum was completed in the reign of Titus in 80 AD. That any of it remains is a wonder. That despite being used as a quarry throughout the Renaissance period, it is still a mighty structure is a miracle. It is oval in shape, some 200 metres long and 150 metres wide. It was made of concrete and stone, 500,000 tons of it, more than the weight of the Empire State Building, and faced originally with marble.
The Colosseum required 100,000 cubic metres of travertine, limestone that comes from about 17 kilometres to the northeast of Rome from a place called Tivoli. And this would have been brought by water down the Anio and into the Tiber, and then landed on the docks, perhaps the other side of the Palatine. It then had to be brought by cart through the streets, and that's just one of the many materials that went into building the Colosseum.
The Colosseum consists of several stories of arched entrances and windows, enclosing an arena which is some 75 metres by 50 and would have contained seating for 50,000 spectators. The seats were carefully numbered and were allocated according to rank. Senators sat in the first tier, citizens in the second, the common men in the third, and women, who were not members of important families, had to share the fourth tier with the men whose job it was to hold in place the giant awning which once covered the arena, protecting the spectators from the sun. When Titus dedicated the Colosseum in 81 AD, he celebrated by paying for entertainments. 9,000 animals, 5,000 of them wild species such as lions, bears, tigers, and even rhinoceroses, were slaughtered in gladiatorial contests.
Well, the Colosseum is often in popular view merely a place for rather bloodthirsty entertainment, but it is important to remember that the very organisation of these gladiatorial shows, wild animal hunts, had a very serious religious function. The origins go back into the Republican period in Rome. Gladiatorial games were held on the occasion of important funerals or funerals of important men, and continued throughout the rest of the imperial period to be held, especially on the occasion of imperial funerals. Private individuals could, if they were very wealthy, also organise gladiatorial games as part of funeral celebrations. But the Colosseum would be used principally for one major festival in December, which was the point at which the magistrates of the city changed over. It's the whole yearly cycle of political and religious existence in the city that the incoming magistrates would pay for a set of games in the Colosseum. And the ritual itself was thought to be both hardening, as it were. It was a shocking experience to see people killed, but it was meant to be bound up with the idea that Roman society as a whole required that sort of ability to confront death.
An interesting and surprising detail of these games is that they seem to have involved female gladiators. When the Roman writer Martial wrote a book celebrating the games, he noted that noble tradition tells how Hercules slew the lion in the wastes of the Nemean Valley. Let the ancient tale be reduced to silence. After your shows, Caesar, we can say that we have seen such deeds performed by a woman's hand. There is, however, no evidence that the Colosseum was ever the venue for the sacrifice of Christians to the lions. Today, the underground passages where animals were caged are exposed to the air. Originally, a wooden floor would have lain over these, which would have been covered with sand to resemble solid ground and to soak up the blood. There is a saying that when the Colosseum falls, then so will Rome. Despite the ravages of time and of looters for its marble, the great amphitheatre still gives an impression of solidity and of endurance. But perhaps the old saying is behind the several attempts, one still being contemplated today, to restore it to its ancient glory. most of what remains on the Palatine Hill dates from much later than the ancient period. Indeed, today, the 16th century villa of the Farnese family, with its fountains, grottos and gardens, must be negotiated before the older ruins can be reached. But even these date from the later Republic, or early Empire, rather than from the earlier time before 509 BC, when Rome suffered the tyranny of kings. The Palatine Hill was the site of imperial residences. Indeed, the word palace is derived from it. However, there is little left, and nothing which could be called palatial. Time has not been merciful to the buildings which once housed the most powerful men in the world.
The earliest traces of settlement on the site of Rome have been found on the Palatine Hill, which the Romans themselves thought of as being the initial focus of settlement. The Palatine Hill is the one closest to the river. It's very naturally defensible. And up there on the top, excavations have found the post holes of a series of huts dating from the 9th to the 8th century BC. The huts would have been quite large. They're about 8 metres by 4 metres, so a sizable hall, walled with wood and wattle and daub, and thatched with reeds. But the Romans themselves, interestingly, in their later tradition, they actually preserved one of these huts as a monument to what they saw as the original settlement on the Palatine, that even in the 4th century AD, tourists to Rome could go and see the hut of Romulus, as they called it.
Ironically, it's not the house of a man which has survived best, but that of a woman. The Casa de Livia, or the House of Livia, named after the infamous and powerful wife of Rome's first emperor in the 1st century BC, lies just behind the unexcavated palace of her son Tiberius, who became the second emperor. In Roman society, women had very few rights and were considered to be second-class citizens. Even women of imperial birth were not officially allowed much responsibility, but unofficially they sometimes wielded an influence which was the next best thing to direct power.
It was a feature of the time to marry for status, to marry people from the right background, to marry to give you a sort of alliance. But these alliances shifted. It's interesting to see how Caesar marries and then remarries. There's that extraordinary but very telling moment when he divorces Pompeii because of her involvement in a scandal over the Bona Dea, a scandal with Clodius, and says Caesar's wife should be above suspicion. And that seems very strange to us. Wouldn't have seemed at all strange in the Roman world, where reputation mattered so much.
Livia was thought to have been a schemer and to have employed guile, cunning, and even poison in her attempts to secure the future of her son. Her husband Augustus, who ruled for 41 years from 27 BC to 14 AD, was known for his skill as an administrator and for his peaceful tenure, which saw the beginning of the Pax Romana, in which the Roman Empire was at its most secure, and which lasted for several decades at the end of the 1st century BC and the beginning of the 1st century AD.
Real change came about in the transition from Republic to Empire. Augustus himself, following a long period, remember, of civil war when very little building was brought to fruition, instigated a whole new programme of civic reconstruction. He was rebuilding the state morally, politically, but also physically. A very famous quote from the biographer Suetonius that Augustus had boasted he found Rome a city of brick, that is mud brick, and left it a city of marble. He was very consciously rebuilding a city to fit the image of the capital of the world.
The Jewish Egyptian historian Philo commented in 38 AD that the whole human race would have been destroyed had it not been for one man, Augustus, who ended wars, set every city at liberty, civilized all unfriendly, savage tribes, and safeguarded peace. But as Tacitus pointed out in 110 AD, he also slowly eroded the power of the Senate, bringing to the role of emperor the powers of an autocrat. This laid the path for the tyrannies which were to follow him.
Everybody had an agenda. Pompey's agenda was to get land for his troops. Caesar's agenda was to try and get a decent province rather than the woods and glens of Italy. And Crassus's agenda was to get a command, get a glory, to establish himself as a frontline figure in Rome. The Senate's agenda, or their opponents in the Senate's agenda, was to stop them. There was this perpetual struggle to prevent any individual from getting too big.
Augustus was also a great patron of the arts. Virgil, Horace and Ovid all flourished under his patronage, although the last of these eventually fell from favour and was finally exiled. Virgil's great masterpiece, the Aeneid, was dedicated to the emperor, who, like the poem's hero Aeneas, was said to be descended from the goddess Venus. Aeneas was also the founder of the Roman people, and Virgil intended his characterization to embody the qualities of purposefulness and service which he knew Augustus valued.
The other change that Augustus brought out was that after his reign, only the emperors were able to build temples or other major public structures. If you think about the famous buildings, they are the Forum of Augustus, the Forum of Trajan, the Baths of Caracalla. All of these major buildings are named after the emperors. Or the temples, they're rebuildings, the Temple of Castor and Pollux, Temple of Antoninus and Faustina, the Pantheon itself, are all buildings built by, for the emperors. No other individual leaves his name on a building after the time of Augustus.
It was a very rigid career structure at Rome. You did take the offices at particular ages or as soon after those particular ages as you could. But a lot of the game was, I suppose, to use those offices and then the generalships and the governorships that came after them to win as much fame, as much glory as possible. It's, I suppose, almost a sort of fame equivalent of a free market economy almost, the assumption that in a free market economy people will try and get as much money as possible, will try and maximize their own profit, and the state will benefit. At Rome, you try to get as much fame and glory along the way as you could, and the state would benefit from that as well.
The Forum was the focus of not only most civic aspirations in the city of Rome itself, but it also pretty soon reflected imperial ambitions as well. What we see now is largely the product of one man's ambitions in particular, and that's Julius Caesar in the middle of the 1st century BC, and his successor, the first Roman emperor, Augustus, because in typical Roman way, power was expressed in terms of building, public building, and they took over Rome's political centre, the Forum, and transformed it into a monument to their own power. The great Basilica Julia was built, the Porticus of Gaius and Lucius, what we call the Basilica Pauli Aemilia, the Temple of Castor and Pollux was rebuilt, and even more importantly, under Augustus, a great temple of deified Julius Caesar, his own adoptive father, was set up at one end of the Forum, matched by a great temple of imperial harmony at the opposite end of the Forum. A new Senate house was built, a new orator's platform was built. It became essentially a sort of dynastic monument to the Roman emperors and the basis on which they claimed power.
Augustus's stepson Tiberius became emperor in AD 14 and was by all accounts equally as effective as chief administrator. His image was fatally tarnished, however, by the fact that he misused the power which Augustus had brought to the position of emperor in pursuit of more selfish ends. Most sensationally, he's believed to have indulged in bizarre lusts and habituated a holiday palace on the island of Capri, which became notorious as a site for his sexual experimentation. This, along with his awkward and pimply appearance and his propensity for drunkenness, did not make him popular, and his death in 37 AD was greeted by cries of "Throw Tiberius in the Tiber." It was during his reign that in the Roman province of Judea, the leader of a Jewish cult, Joshua ben Joseph, was executed by crucifixion. Tiberius probably never heard of the man, called Jesus the Christ in Greek, and even if he had, would not have imagined that eventually his cult would become the dominant religion of the Roman people, after the great Jupiter and Neptune and all the other pagan gods had begun to be forgotten. The site of his mother's house is relatively small and simple next to the sprawling magnificence of the Palace of Domitian, which dates from the end of the 1st century AD. Domitian was perhaps the cruelest of Rome's tyrannical emperors and was responsible for the most bloody of the persecutions of the Christians. It is perhaps apt that he came to one of the bloodiest ends to befall a Roman emperor when he was murdered by an ex-slave in 96 AD.
During the last 3 centuries BC, the Forum gradually got more and more architecturally enhanced, as they say, that as Rome took over the rest of the Mediterranean, and particularly the Eastern Mediterranean and all the Greek cities, they imported back to Rome the models that they could see out there, this marvellous public architecture in stone. And the Roman Forum was one of the major focuses of this new imported architecture. And they built great basilicas and porticuses, and the temples got rebuilt, and everything got ever more luxury architecture.
All of these sacred buildings lie along what was called the Via Sacra. Nearby, on the Forum, was the site of the temple of Castor and Pollux, the twin gods credited with fighting on the side of the Romans in their battles against the Latins in the 5th century BC. The temple was dedicated to them in the 5th century BC, but the 6 Corinthian columns which remain are from 6 AD. The splendid entablature which surmounts it is, however, an addition dating from the time of the mighty Augustus. Further along the road, the much younger Temple of Julius Caesar has fared even less well. The temple where the mortal remains of the famous dictator were brought, where Rome's first great conqueror and empire builder was cremated, where he, whose avowed aim was to outshine Alexander the Great, was deified by his successor Augustus, is now no more than rubble.
Well, the thing to remember particularly about Rome is that by the end of the 1st century BC, with the first emperor Augustus, it was the largest city in the ancient world. It had well over 1 million people, perhaps very, very more than 1 million people. It was at least twice the size of its nearest rival. This made it a very special place, and it makes it a very remarkable archaeological site. It's a place where the emperors essentially expressed every ambition they ever had about their own power and about the power of the Roman Empire.
Later temples remained places of worship long after the old gods and deified emperors to which they were first dedicated had been forgotten or ignored. On the Via Sacra stands the temple of the deified Antonius Pius and Faustina, which dates from 141 AD, but which, since the 11th century, has been a consecrated church, the Church of San Lorenzo in Miranda. Only the porch and frieze of the original temple remain. If a building could find another use, and most notably as a church, it stood a stronger chance of survival, and a number of very important Roman buildings have been protected in this way. Another such in the Forum is the Curia, which stands much as it was rebuilt in 283 AD. This was originally the meeting place of the Roman Senate, but owes its remarkably good condition to its conversion to use as a place of Christian worship. The senators were a body whose power and influence were linked to the magnanimity of whoever was emperor. Under Trajan, for instance, they were valued and used as counselors and as safeguards for the public good. But in the time of Caligula, Tiberius's disastrous successor, they were no more than puppets. It is said that Caligula even added his favorite horse to their number. Christianity became the dominant religion of the Romans only after it was adopted by an emperor in the 4th century. That emperor was Constantine. It may be that Constantine's worship of Christ was merely a development of his earlier devotion to the cult of the sun god. But legend has it that before the battle he fought against Maxentius over the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, he had a dream in which he saw the sign of Christ. The battle he subsequently fought was successful, and Maxentius was forced to abandon his position and was driven into the river Tiber. Whatever the manner of his conversion, it had real consequences for the Christians of the Roman Empire, who were recovering from one of the cruelest of their persecutions under Diocletian. The Basilica of Constantine dominates the east of the Forum. This massive structure, begun by Maxentius in about 306 AD, but finished by Constantine, was amongst the last great buildings to be constructed in Imperial Rome. The nave is thought to have reached a height of 40 meters.
A whole new series of forums were built subsequently. The old Roman Forum was not the only one for the whole of the later history of Rome, and all of them in their way took their model from the original Forum. These are the ones where all the great ceremonies of state would take place. Imperial funerals were staged, you name it, any sort of major expression of political and social and religious activity in Rome still was focused predominantly or took place by way of the Forum. As the emperors conquered more territories, the great triumphal procession, for instance, which started on beside the Tiber, down on the plain of the Field of Mars, the god of war, proceeded up into the Forum, out of the Forum, and then back into the Forum on its way up to the Capitoline Hill. The Forum was integral to later Roman ceremony as much as it had been in the earliest days, but it was transformed architecturally into an expression of the great might of the Roman Empire.
Looking down on the Forum from the Palatine Hill, as the imperial family would have done, its east entrance is marked by the Arch of Titus. Titus was emperor for just 2 years and was a man of dangerous charm and, like Tiberius and Nero before him, of strange lusts. Like Tiberius, but unlike Nero, he also seems to have been a good administrator and a skilled soldier. This latter quality is celebrated in his arch. This was originally erected in 81 AD to celebrate the capitulation of Jerusalem to imperial forces, and is famous for its two reliefs, which inaugurated a type of illustration new to Roman sculpture. On one side can be seen Titus riding in his triumphant chariot. On the other, another part of the triumphal procession carries the booty off from the Temple of Jerusalem. Looking outside the Forum, the Arch of Constantine can be seen. In marked contrast to the Arch of Titus, this one symbolizes the transition of Rome from pagan stronghold to center of Christianity. It was commissioned by the Senate in honor of the first Christian emperor. It's covered by old reliefs culled from older edifices, monuments to Hadrian, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius. The friezes, which date from Constantine's own time, are feeble by comparison. The empire by this time was changing, and Rome's days as ruler of the world numbered. One of the greatest desecrations ever committed by a 20th century politician against an ancient legacy must have been that committed by Mussolini against the Fori Imperiali. This site contained the remains of forums built outside the main forum after the time of Julius Caesar, as the expansion of the empire called for more administrative activity at its center. These were covered by buildings in the Renaissance, but uncovered again in 1924, when Mussolini cleared the area in preparation for a wide avenue. The avenue would have given him the opportunity to hold military parades, which could employ the impressive Colosseum as a backdrop. He hoped, no doubt, that this would imply that the empire that he hoped to establish was one which would reflect that of Italy's ancient ancestors. Mussolini paved over much of the forums and proceeded with the building of his avenue, now a main route through the city and never free of traffic. Chief among the surviving treasures is Trajan's Column, which holds a set of narrative reliefs spiralling up it. These magnificent illustrations tell the story of Rome's wars against and eventual victory over Dacia, now modern Romania, in 106 AD. They're famed for the realism of their detail. Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 AD, was considered one of the good emperors and was famous for getting on well with his senators and for the diplomacy he showed in all his dealings. But the best preserved of the ancient treasures to be found in Rome lies a little way off from the Forum, the Palatine Hill and the Colosseum. Nestling in the narrow streets around the Piazza della Rotonda, the Pantheon is like a giant tree trunk which betrays its age through its exposed rings. Originally, this location would have been the Campus Martius and would have been equally as crowded, with offices, public baths, and temples. Entering its domed interior would have been like stepping from chaos into serenity. This awesome building spans the centuries not as a dead relic, but as a living building, constantly maintained, constantly growing. It was built as a pagan temple by the Emperor Hadrian in 126 AD.
perhaps not surprisingly, because it is the best preserved of all Roman buildings anywhere in the Roman world, the Pantheon has been the subject of the debate ever since the Renaissance. It's particularly unsatisfying to trained architectural eyes because there seems to be a misfit between the porch, the part you go in through, and the circular domed interior. It's also enigmatic in terms of its function. Our literary sources, our ancient sources, hardly mention it at all. It may have been dedicated to all the gods, hence Pantheon. It was also certainly used by Hadrian as an audience chamber. It's certainly not a temple in the normal Roman sense of the word. Because it's circular and domed, and because its light comes through this central part, it's also been invested with a certain cosmic significance. And a lot of debate is really concerned to what extent there is some sort of grand order in the design of the Pantheon. What's more interesting to me, of course, is that this was, until the 19th century, the largest single domed space anywhere. It's larger by a few feet than the Dome of St. Peter's in Rome and the Dome of Christopher Wren's St. Paul's in London.
Pantheon is remarkable on many, many different scores. Apart from being the largest concrete dome in the Roman world, it's also the best surviving Roman building we have. It's situated right in the middle of the field of Mars. So the Pantheon, which looks out onto all this space, would be the sort of place where the emperor could sit in state, surrounded by statues of the gods and his ancestors in the niches all around the walls, and the whole court.
In the popular mind, Hadrian is best remembered for the wall which spans the ancient border between Britain and Caledonia, a practical rough brick structure along which Roman soldiers would patrol. Nothing could be more different than the Pantheon, truly Hadrian's great gift to the world. Originally it was built by Agrippa in 27 BC. Hadrian had this structure demolished, however, and after building the redesigned Pantheon, remembered Agrippa's original building by carving his name across the new one's front. For centuries, this led to confusion over the identity of the Pantheon's architect and its date. It is a stunningly impressive structure today, despite missing the bronze which would have originally lined its roof. The bronze beams which had once supported the porch roof went to St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, requisitioned by Pope Urban VIII for Bernini's Baldacchino. In medieval times, it was converted into a church, and later its porch became a marketplace, where poultry and then fish were sold as late as 1845. Most importantly, it survived. Over the centuries, the ground level surrounding it has risen, so that when one comes across it, entering the square from the winding streets, it appears squat, short but very broad. It would not have done so at the time, of course. The dome's span is larger than that of St. Peter's Basilica. Its oculus lets in just the right amount of light to give the interior an ethereal quality. At the rear can be seen friezes from the Basilica of Neptune which adjoins it, but elsewhere are Christian chapels and tombs. Italian kings are buried here, and so are artists, including the great Renaissance painter Raphael. This building takes us vividly back to ancient Rome and shows us its best side, the tranquil opposite to the blood and guts entertainments held in the Colosseum, the centre of calm in the midst of a bustling city, and perhaps a site of reflection at the heart of an ever-growing, ever-warring empire. It is perhaps heartening that so many of Rome's archaeological treasures, the remnants of buildings erected by her great rulers. Some who were good, but many who were bad, have survived. We in the West are fortunate to be able to claim this sophisticated civilization to be our own, offering up its tales of history and showing us the origins of our cultured and civilized world.